Hello everyone and welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. Each week together we will take a look at a unique and fascinating piece of history. As gruesome, mysterious or unbelievable as these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have made their mark on our historical landscape. Be sure to check out the website mysteriesofhistory.com where you can access all of the podcasts and show notes, and of course the blog where we will give you some extra insight into each episode as well as all sorts of unbelievable historical content. You can also find us on social media where you can let us know what you make of the podcast episodes and gives you all a chance to start a good old historical debate. So now let's take a look at this week's mysterious historical tale. In the mystical heart of the Somerset Levels, among the ruins of ancient stones and legends of Avalon, once stood the greatest abbey in all of England, Glastonbury Abbey. Revered for its sacred relics, whispers of King Arthur, and great wealth, it stood for centuries, until the year 1539, where the last Abbott Richard Whiting, a principled and devoted man, stood up to the might of King Henry VIII and his vision for a new religious path for England. This was the undoing of Richard Whiting, and he would pay a terrible price. So let's start right at the beginning and find out how Glastonbury Abbey became this powerhouse within England and indeed Europe. And why did Abbott Whiting and Glastonbury Abbey cause such a problem for Henry VIII? So Glastonbury Abbey, or the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey, still stand in the town of Glastonbury, which is in Somerset in the southwest of England. And Glastonbury itself is would have been an island up until a couple of hundred years ago, and is surrounded by the Somerset Levels, which would have been marshy, boggy areas. So the abbey was positioned well in a prominent position and naturally defended by the surrounding landscape. Archaeologists and historians believe that there has been Roman and Saxon occupation of the site previous to the abbey, and indeed the University of Reading have carried out archaeological excavations at the site and found evidence to support this. So the abbey itself was established in the year 712 AD, when King Einar of Wessex is reported to have directed a stone church to be built on the site, the foundations of which form the west end of the current nave of the abbey. So glassworks were established here in the abbey site in the 7th century, but Glastonbury was affected by the Viking invasions of the 9th century. Although it's uncertain whether the abbey itself was attacked, but it is quite likely that the Vikings would certainly have had their eye on it at some point. Now in the 10th century, the abbey was enlarged by the Abbot Dunstan, who actually was a central figure in the revival of English monastic life. He was responsible for instituting the Benedictine rule for the monks at Glastonbury Abbey. Now the rule of St. Benedict is where monks are essentially following a set of guidelines as written by St. Benedict of Nursia, who lived in about 530 AD. And it became really popular due to its balance and moderation. Now the rule of St. Benedict was essentially 73 short chapters written in Latin by St. Benedict of Nursia. Over half of the chapters are about obedience and being humble, and also how to run a monastery and how it should be managed, and the importance of the role of monks living in an isolated community under the leadership of an abbot. Now, Abbot Dunstan actually became Archbishop of Canterbury in 960 AD. So the abbey steadily grew in wealth and power and indeed size, but disaster struck in the year 1184, where most of the abbey was actually burnt down. However, by the 14th century, Glastonbury Abbey became one of the most powerful and wealthy establishments in England, if not the whole of Europe. And in fact, there's an English medieval proverb that people would have known at the time, that said that if the Abbot of Glastonbury married the Abbess of Shaftesbury is located in the county of Dorset, their heir would have had more land than the King of England. Now, as we're going to find out a bit later in this podcast, wealthy monasteries with land and power and a very headstrong king, shall we say, did not bode well for the future of the monasteries. So it's fair to ask, how did the monasteries become so wealthy? After all, these were people living simple lives, following the rule of St. Benedict. Well, the monks, it turns out, were quite a savvy bunch and had quite a few ways of generating vast amounts of income. To start with, being the custodian of some relics or bones of a saint was an excellent way to get people to make pilgrimage or travel to your establishment, your monastery or abbey, and pay homage to the saint. And this was often in the form of financial donations to the establishment, in other words, to Glastonbury Abbey in this case. And we know for a fact that in the Middle Ages, bone fragments of St. Caesarius, a Teresina, were moved to Glastonbury Abbey for this very purpose, and Glastonbury Abbey generated a lot of money by encouraging people to pay homage to the saint, and people were very willing to do this. And one of the main reasons they did pay homage, shall we say, to the saint was because they were paying penance. In other words, they were paying for their sins. An excellent way to pay for your sins in the Middle Ages was to go on a pilgrimage, thereby showing repentance to God. Again, we have to remember we're in the Middle Ages at this time period that we're talking about, and Catholicism was central, religion was central to everybody's lives. So people genuinely believed that by making pilgrimage to a place like Glastonbury Abbey, they really would repent their sins and almost start afresh, if you like. Another concept that also evolved in this time period was the concept of indulgences. And that is where individuals were allowed to receive remission, if you like, of penalties for sin, either in whole or in part, through acts of charity or devotion. Now, when we say charity, that was most often financial donations, again, to the monasteries or abbeys, so that prayers could be said for you. So this enterprise, if you like, was certainly happening at Glastonbury Abbey, which gradually made it a very, very wealthy establishment, as we've discussed. But by 1191, pilgrimages to Glastonbury Abbey had declined, so the income for the abbey was less, or not as much as it should have been. But this coincided with the discovery of the tombs of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere in the cemetery. Miraculous. And it also keeps pilgrims coming. Now, I better make clear at this point that King Arthur and Queen Guinevere are contentious figures in such that most historians don't believe that they actually existed. And in fact, historians dismiss the idea that obviously their graves were discovered by the monks at Glastonbury Abbey, and they generally suggest that it was a publicity stunt by the monks to raise funds to repair the abbey that was mostly destroyed by fire in 1184. Now, Glastonbury is still known as the ancient Isle of Avalon. Now, this is largely down to the monks, the medieval monks, who also suggested that Glastonbury was the Isle of Avalon, as per the King Arthur, Queen Guinevere narrative. They even suggested that the Holy Grail was buried, or is buried even still now, underneath Glastonbury Tor, a place that's going to become very relevant soon to our story. And to top it off, medieval legend also claimed that the abbey was founded by Joseph of Arimathea, the uncle of Jesus Christ, in the 1st century, and the story goes that he visited the abbey site, planted his staff in the ground, and out of it sprung the holy thorn, the famous holy thorn, which up until very recently existed at the site of Glastonbury Abbey, and you could visit it until, of course, somebody decided to chop it down in a mindless act of vandalism. So there we are. We now have an understanding of how Glastonbury Abbey became this powerhouse in the mid-16th century or early 16th century. And now we must talk about King Henry VIII, because this is where things go drastically wrong for the Abbey, and in fact become quite terminal. Now, this part of the podcast could really have its own dedicated podcast, because there is a lot to talk about, but I'll just inform you about the main points as to why monasteries declined in the UK and why they were destroyed, in fact, by Henry VIII, and very quickly, and the reasons behind it. For context, in 1536 there were over 850 monasteries, nunneries and friaries in England, but by 1541 there were none. Over 15,000 monks and nuns were dispersed and their buildings seized by the crown. So why did Henry VIII pursue this course of action? Well, he was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and unfortunately she did not bear him a male heir, so Henry VIII desperately wanted to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. But unfortunately the Pope would not grant this. Pope Clement VII refused to grant Henry VIII an annulment to his marriage, and indeed Roman Catholic doctrine at the time viewed marriage as something that was a contract until death. Henry was convinced that God was trying to punish him for marrying his late brother Arthur's wife. So on the 3rd of November 1534, the first Act of Supremacy was passed in Parliament, and this essentially said that King Henry VIII of England was, and subsequent monarchs in fact, had royal supremacy and were the supreme head of the Church of England. So this is a break with Rome and the Pope especially. Henry is withdrawing his support for the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, and is asserting the independence of what was known as the Ecclesia Anglicana, the English Church. King Henry VIII subsequently passed the Treasons Act, which stated that to disavow the Act of Supremacy and to deprive the king of his dignity, title or name was to be considered treason. So in other words, that the English religion was absolute, and those who held on to the Catholic belief or Catholic faith were to be punished or committing treason. Now this does not bode well for all the monasteries in England, and of course Glastonbury Abbey is one of those monasteries, one of those abbeys, and of course it's Catholic. So Henry VIII invokes two Acts of Parliament, those being the First Suppression Act of 1535 and the Second Suppression Act of 1539, in what becomes known as the dissolution of the monasteries. And it was a set of administrative and legal processes that between 1536 and 1541 disbanded all Catholic monasteries, priories, convents and friaries in England, Wales and Ireland, seizing their wealth, disposing of their assets, destroying the buildings and relics, and dispersing or destroying the vast libraries that many of these monasteries and abbeys had. And some historians even describe it as the greatest dislocation of people, property and daily life since the Norman conquest. So that's a really significant event that was happening in the 1530s and early 1540s in England, and had a catastrophic effect at Glastonbury Abbey. Now, Glastonbury Abbey was regarded as having significant amounts of silver, gold and vast swathes of land under its ownership. So in September 1539, the abbey was visited by Richard Leighton, Richard Pollard and Thomas Moyle, who arrived there without warning on the orders of Thomas Cromwell, the chief minister of Henry VIII between 1534 and 1540. Now, Richard Whiting, the abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, had originally signed the Act of Supremacy, which, as we know, made Henry VIII the head of the church, but Whiting refused to surrender the abbey, which didn't actually fall under the Act of Suppression of the lesser houses, as they were known. Abbott Whiting also wanted to remain loyal to Rome and the Catholic faith, which he held so dear to him. In 1539, Glastonbury Abbey was the only monastery left in Somerset. So then when Thomas Cromwell's commissioners, Leighton, Pollard and Moyle, arrived at Glastonbury Abbey in September 1539, they expected to find huge wealth, but they initially didn't find a great deal. And after proceeding to carry out a more thorough search, they found money and gold and jewellery secured in vaults and even between wall panels at the abbey. And there was also a rumour that Other items of high value had been stashed away in land surrounding Glastonbury Abbey, and there's even a rumour that there's jewels and gold and other bits and pieces buried underneath Glastonbury Tor. Now, it's important to note that Abbott Whiting at this point was in his late 70s or perhaps even early 80s. But he was arrested anyway, and he was actually sent to the Tower of London to be questioned by Thomas Cromwell himself. Now, the exact charge that Whiting was arrested under, if you like, was probably that of treason. And in fact, the French ambassador on the 25th of October 1539, a chap by the name of Marillac, writes, "The Abbot of Glastonbury has lately been put in the Tower because in taking the Abbey treasures, valued at 200,000 crowns, they found a written book in arguments in behalf of Queen Catherine." Now, this isn't very good either for Whiting, because this is suggesting that he is writing about his support for Catherine of Aragon, the Catholic queen that Henry VIII was so desperate to divorce. This so-called evidence really is not going to go in Abbott Whiting's favour and really does seal the deal for him. So on the 14th of November, Abbott Whiting returns from the Tower of London with Pollard, one of the commissioners under Thomas Cromwell, and a trial apparently takes place where he's convicted of robbing Glastonbury Church. Now, as I've previously said, Abbott Whiting is an old man, possibly in his 80s at this point, but he is shown no mercy. Henry VIII will show no mercy to a traitor of England, especially a religious traitor. So, the next day, on Saturday the 15th of November, along with two of his monks, John Thorne, the treasurer of the church, and Roger James, who was a sacristan, all three were taken to Glastonbury Tor. For those of you who aren't aware, Glastonbury Tor is essentially a large hill behind the town of Glastonbury, on top of stands a medieval church tower. Now, for our listeners from further afield who aren't perhaps familiar with Tudor forms of punishment, what I can say is that they are rather harsh, as we're about to find out. So at this point, I just want to let listeners know that what I'm about to describe is somewhat graphic, so if you're eating a meal, perhaps put it down and I will describe this as quickly as possible. So on Saturday the 15th of November, Whiting and the two monks from Glastonbury Abbey were dragged by horses on hurdles to the top of Glastonbury Tor, where they were hung until they weren't quite dead. Then they were cut down, cut open, still alive at this point by the way, had their insides removed, burnt in front of them, and then their bodies were cut into 4 quarters. Abbott Whiting's head was placed on a pike over the west gate of the now deserted Glastonbury Abbey, and parts of his body were exposed at the nearby towns of Wells, Bath, Ilchester and Bridgewater. And this was often done as a way of showing the people, showing the community, this is what happens to you if you commit a crime. If you cross us, we will do this to you. This is clearly an unbelievably brutal course of action to take against a man who really, his only real crime in the eyes of the state was to remain true to the Catholic faith. And the Catholic faith hasn't forgotten Whiting. In fact, in 1895, he was beatified, he was made a saint by Pope Leo XIII. So there we have it, the demise of Abbott Whiting and the destruction of Glastonbury Abbey. In fact, most abbeys in the United Kingdom, in England, are now in ruin due to the actions of Henry VIII during the 1530s and 1540s. Abbott Whiting was clearly a principled man, and contemporary reports suggest he was quite a peaceful man, but he had the misfortune of living during the reign of one of the most volatile British monarchs that have ever existed. The will of Henry VIII had to be met. His demands had to be met, and if you crossed him in any way, you paid the ultimate price, as is the case here with Abbott Whiting. After the demise of the last abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, Abbott Whiting, Glastonbury Abbey was looted, left to decay, its stones were pulled down and its altars smashed. Richard Whiting became one of the Reformation's quiet martyrs, if you like, and as we have mentioned, was beatified centuries later by the Catholic Church. Now, even today, Glastonbury is still a place of myth, music, mystery and pilgrimage. The legends of Avalon and the Holy Grail still prevail. And in amongst that is the true story of a man who stood at the end of an age. Richard Whiting's death marked not just the fall of an abbey, but the end of medieval England itself. Now, this is where I plan to end the podcast, but then I remember that I have 2 photographs that I think you are going to find quite interesting. Now, head over to the blog and I'll post them on there. Have a look closely at the 2 photographs and let me know what you think you can see. Now, I'll put a bit of context behind these 2 photographs. I acquired them from a friend of mine, and this is the story that he has told me, and I shall share with you now. So basically, the friend of mine in question, his brother in the 1970s worked for the National Trust, and he had a commission, he had a job where he had to go around all of the National Trust properties in a particular region and photograph them. This chap was a photographer. So on this particular day, he had to go to Glastonbury tour, and his task was to take an accurate shot of the tour with no people in the shot because the National Trust wanted to have a good shot of the building, the tour itself, to look for any damage and plan any repairs that they may need to do in the future. So the chap in question set up his tripod, walked around the tour and made sure that there was nobody walking up towards the tour. There's 2 pathways up to the tour, that there was nobody in the building itself. He was satisfied that there was no one there, and then he set up and took his photographs. And it was only when he got back to process his photographs that he found that in a couple of the photographs there was something that shouldn't be there. In fact, he had 2 photographs where he found 2 separate images, something that shouldn't be in the archway of the tour. He took a series of photographs, many of them were fine, as he planned, but these 2 stood out. And those photographs are what you can see on the blog. What is it? Who is it? I don't know. But is it Abbott Whiting, perhaps?